Each time those stories bubble up, you only get a sliver of the story of Amelia Earhart. And I thought it would be really interesting to explore her life further. 90 years or so since she disappeared. And that message is still one that many women want to hear.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Rachel Hartigan. Rachel Hartigan has just recently published her first book called Lost, Amelia Earhart's 3 Mysterious Deaths and 1 Extraordinary Life, published by National Geographic. Rachel Hartigan has written about everything from the genetics to the long road to women's suffrage for National Geographic, where she worked as a writer, reporter, and editor from 2012 to 2024, a former editor of the Washington Post's book world. She also covered education and culture for US News and World Report. Welcome, Rachel Hartigan, to the show. It's such a blessing to have you, and congratulations for your outstanding work.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
First and foremost, introduce yourself in simply one powerful sentence.
Oh, wow. I believe in wonder and humanity.
That is amazing. I think that's what we really need, especially in the age of AI. I think there's so much out there, and especially as a journalist, as a professional journalist as you are. And therefore, I also want to touch a little bit about just the profession in general, what actually a journalist does, because it's not always so clear, at least what we occasionally apprehend from the news. So, but first and foremost, give us a context of your life so we can actually potentially put some dots together in order to make sense of your past. So lay out a little bit your childhood and what brought you of becoming a journalist and then ultimately a journalist for National Geographic, and then lastly, really writing a book. I mean, it's huge. It's one thing being a journalist, but it's a whole other ball game of writing actually a book.
Yeah, it was very different. Well, I grew up in Reno, Nevada, which people have said to me many times that I'm the only person they've ever met from Nevada, but there are plenty of people there who have jobs and live lives. So I grew up there, and, it was very middle class life in suburbia, but my dad was a medieval history professor. My mom was a teacher, and they were very into books and education. And our summer vacation was always going up to Ashland, Oregon, where they have a Shakespeare festival. And I thought that was just the most magical thing in the world, to see all these actors performing these stories with these beautiful words that you never hear in your day-to-day. And I think that just really embedded into the core of my being. But as I grew up, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew that I liked words, I liked stories, I liked to learn about things, I liked to read. So I was a history major, which prepares you for everything and nothing at the same time. And moved back home, and my dad was a little bit frustrated with my lack of direction. So he handed me a copy of Harper's Magazine, which is sort of a intellectual thought magazine out of New York City. And they had an ad for internships. And he said, you should apply for this. So I applied for it and got it miraculously and ended up in New York, introduced to the world of magazines. And I had gone to Yale in Connecticut, so I was familiar with East Coast, and I was familiar with sort of somewhat intellectual life, but this was still very eye-opening for me to see that, okay, here are people where their jobs are to think about not just ideas and stories, but what shape to put them in to make them interesting to people. So I was like, okay, this is the place for me. I ended up moving down to Washington, D.C., and moved from magazine to magazine I got laid off or the magazine folded, and eventually found myself at U.S. News and World Report, which has the college guides and the college rankings, which I worked on for a while. And I realized that that was not something that I was really that interested in, because it was very policy oriented and kind of tied up with achievement and what's the word I'm looking for? Just you want to be in the number one school, not the number two school. And I thought, I went to one of the top schools and it was fine, but it wasn't. There's plenty of schools that are great. So I decided I was more interested in a more humanist approach. Maybe I wasn't really articulating that to myself. I had gotten married and had a baby and found out about this wonderful part-time job in the book section at the Washington Post. And I thought, that's perfect. Part-time, all books, that's the place for me. And it was really a wonderful place. And I mean, the one thing I really took away from there is that at one point, everybody except for maybe two of us was working on a book. I was like, oh, like people I know can write books. That's something that people can do. And then I moved on to National Geographic, which was totally a different thing. And I can talk about that a little bit more. But that was a place that really emphasized travel and getting out into the world, into the field. And that was not something I had done as much. So I was very intimidated. But when I got there, I decided I'm just going to say yes to things and see where it goes.
That's amazing, but also tell us a little bit how it actually was and how you were approaching this, because it's one thing, having a major in history, but it's another thing to actually write as a journalist. So it's very different styles and so on. So how did you learn it? Did you really learn it on the go, basically? And how was that?
Yes. It was hard. I did learn. I didn't go to journalism school. My apologies. My dog is acting up in the background. I didn't go to journalism school. I learned from being edited. Okay, they're done. I really just learned from writing and then really paying attention to what the questions the editor asked me. And then I realized, I should have asked. If I called somebody up to ask a question, I should have asked that question. And it was really just a process of trial and error and lots of error until I really got to sort of internalize the kinds of information that a reader might need to know in a story. But it was challenging. And, looking back, I wouldn't necessarily advise anybody to take the path I did, because it was very meandering and not direct in any way. And there's some things that I never totally learned. I mean, I think if you go to journalism school, you get a much more grounded and, this is what you do in this situation. This is what you do in that situation. I was a lot of time just winging it. But, I knew the basic ethics of it, and was always trying to make sure that I was serving both the reader and also being fair to whoever I was writing about. And those two things were basically my guideposts as I went forward.
Yeah, you brought it really, really far. I mean, National Geographic is really basically the one that you want to end up, especially if you want to explore really the world. So, give us a taste on how this really unfolded and how much you like the job at National Geographic, and then really go into how you found yourself with this incredible story, but then ultimately also writing actually a book about it.
Yeah, well, as I said, when I got to National Geographic, I just thought, well, I'm just going to say yes to whatever they asked me to do. And my first two assignments could not have been more different. One was to write short text. I mean, maybe it was 800 words or something to go with these just crazy, beautiful photographs of people in Europe who dress up in costumes for Mardi Gras or Christmas. And a lot of these costumes are left over from pagan celebrations. So they're just, wild men and beasts. They're just very strange and wonderful. So I had to write in a very lyrical, non journalistic way about them, but also convey what the actual story was, what they were actually doing, how long these practices had been around, that kind of thing. And then the other thing that I was one of my first assignments was uh, a graphic, and National Geographic does these amazing graphics explaining all sorts of things like a dolphin's brain or how the gladiators fought. But this one, and I've done both of those. I wrote graphics for both of those, but the first one was on how fracking works. The way that natural gas is brought up from up and out of the earth. And so that was very totally different. That was not lyrical or poetic at all. That had to be very factual, and we had to get everything right. And the writing had to be very specific because it was, just labels to pictures, but it was all as much effort as writing something 800 words, 1,000 words. So I think those two stories encompass the kinds of things I was writing about. And I ended up doing just so many different things. And it was, it's just really fun because National Geographic is basically about the world. And it's also about history and it's about science. And, we cover basically everything, or we covered basically everything. So, but I did go on some reporting trips. But they were in the US. I went down to Florida to look at some animal sanctuaries that weren't great for the animals. I went to Montana to see buffalo being released into the wild. That was amazing. But the way I got connected to this Amelia Earhart story is that I was literally just outside of the copy room on the fourth floor of the National Geographic building, and one of the editors stopped me and said, we have a berth on this ship that's going to an island where some people think Amelia Earhart died. Do you want to go and cover this expedition? And I said, sure. And then I thought, oh God, I don't know where I'm going. I should probably talk to my family, you know, and I didn't know much more about Amelia Earhart than what we learned in elementary school. I mean, I knew that she was a famous pilot. I knew that she was, you know, she had broken all these records as a female pilot. And I knew she had disappeared somewhere, but I didn't really have a strong sense of where. So I had a lot of things to catch up on. So that was my first exposure, is going out on this expedition. And it turned out it was in the middle of the Pacific, to the Phoenix Islands, which are a part of Kiribati. And it's about a 5-day sail from Fiji. So really, really isolated. So that was my first time I experienced something like that.
What was it like?
Oh, it was wonderful. I mean, the expedition was a little bit odd in that it was, in order to fund it, I mean, it's very expensive to get out there. The organization that National Geographic was working with, the organization is called the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery. They had partnered with a travel company so to book a cruise ship, and there were a bunch of people who had signed on as, you know, as their vacation, but to be citizen scientists to work on this expedition. So we were on this cruise ship with all these vacationers, but also there was the National Geographic team and there was the Tigar team, you know, and they were archaeologists and other specialists. And we left in the middle of the night from Fiji, so I didn't really have I was asleep when we left the berth or left the dock. And when I woke up, I stepped out of my room and I couldn't see anything except for water. And that was such a weird physical shock, just to be so isolated out in the world. And then I discovered that I get very seasick, so that wasn't fun. But the island itself, called Nikamororo, is just beautiful. It's not very big. It's, let's see, I'm going to get the link right. It's, you know, it's a coral atoll with a reef around it and a lagoon in the middle, palm trees, thousands of birds, giant crabs. And the reason that this group thinks Earhart ended up there is that she was doing a flight around the world at the equator, and nobody had done that before. She was flying with a navigator named Fred Noonan. They were just a few legs away from being done. They had started off in California and then flown east. But this time, and this was July 1937, they took off from New Guinea and were aiming for this island called Howland. And they never arrived at Howland. And so this group, Tigar, thinks they got lost and were south of Howland and saw Nikamororo and saw the reef around it and thought, oh, we can land there. And they landed there and then died as castaways. So we were there to look for the bones of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan.
And before you arrived, before you went on this mission, before you really embarked on the boat, what were your expectations?
I was so in the moment a lot of the time that I don't know that I had expectations, because I was worried about, you know, I was supposed to be writing stories the whole time. So I was just focused on, am I talking to the right person? Am I seeing the right thing? You know, when we were in Fiji, the dogs had been brought over from California, but they needed to be quarantined. I wanted to make sure I was going with the trainers to see the dogs in the quarantine. I was so focused on making sure that I was doing my job that I almost didn't have any expectations. And the whole thing was so outside of my experience that it was hard to have expectations. And meanwhile, you know, there were two videographers, National Geographic videographers, and they had both been everywhere and done everything. And I was trying not to seem like a total newbie in front of them. So I was just so focused on making sure that I was doing the job that I'd been assigned to do that I was in the moment.
There are a lot of theories, obviously, and you actually lay it out. There are also potentially 3 deaths of what you actually talk about in the book, but you won't really go into that because obviously we won't give away the book. But what is your initial instincts? What does it tell you what it might be and what might have happened, you know, in 1937?
Well, when I first went out, I was very impressed with all the evidence that she ended up at this island. They had found a place where somebody had built a campfire They had found some bottles that seemed to have been used to boil water on the fire. They found clamshells that had been opened in a way that islanders wouldn't have opened it. They'd been kind of smashed. Over the years, they'd found items from the 1930s, a zipper pull, jackknife. They found a shoe heel at some point. So all of these things I found very compelling. And really, it wasn't until I started working on the book that I realized that, yes, all these things are so compelling, but there's still some big gaps in what we understand and logical gaps about why she would have flown so far south. So, I mean, I can just give a brief outline of the theories just so people know what they are. They've probably encountered them indirectly in the news anyways. But the main theory and the simplest theory is that she ran out of gas and ended up in the ocean. She crashed and died in the crash. And then there's the theory that she landed on this island. And then there's the theory that she got lost and ended up in Japanese territory. And Japan controlled much of Micronesia at the time. And they were fairly, they didn't let a lot of foreigners onto the islands. And at the time in the 30s, they'd been very aggressive towards China, and the US and the UK and lots of other countries were kind of worried, or they just didn't know if Japan was planning anything. So there was a lot of paranoia that was then obviously fed by World War II. So that theory is that she ended up in Japanese territory, and she and Noonan either died from dysentery or something like that, or they were executed. That one has probably the least amount of compelling theory, although there are eyewitnesses who claim to have seen her. But the thing that compelled me a lot about these theories was more how they developed and what the driving forces were behind them, both the historical context, the psychological context of the searchers, whether any of them could actually had strong evidence or not, or whether strong evidence could be developed. So I didn't set out to write the book to find the answer. I just was more interested in exploring the process that people had gone through.
And walk us through, when did you decide that you actually want to write a book, really Lost, Amelia Earhart's 3 Mysterious Deaths and 1 Extraordinary Life? So when was described the moment when you felt like, I gotta write the book? And what were some of your fears that you had along the way?
Mm. Well, when I was on that first expedition, people kept saying, "Oh, you should write a book about this." And I couldn't figure out how to do it, especially because we didn't find anything. We didn't find any bones. There's no conclusion. So what exactly is the story? And then I went on a second expedition to the same island, but this time with Bob Ballard, who's the scientist who found the Titanic. And he was looking in the ocean. And then I was writing a bunch of stories, filing a bunch of stories to National Geographic from there. And I mean, this isn't very glamorous or exciting, but a literary agent reached out to me and said, "I really like your stories. Have you thought about turning them into a book?" And by this point, I knew a lot more about Amelia Earhart. I knew a lot more about the theories, and I was starting to have, I don't know, qualms might be too strong a word, but just a sense that the way I was writing about Earhart wasn't telling the full story. And that, periodically these news stories bubble up about another search for Earhart. I mean, there was just one about a year ago where people said they were looking for her in the ocean and they said they found her, but then it turned out not to be the plane. But each time those stories bubble up, you only get a sliver of the story of Amelia Earhart. And I thought it would be really interesting to explore her life further. And then I also just really wanted to explore these other, as I mentioned, the context. So it took me several months of really thinking about, well, how would I tell this story? And then I started to read other books that seemed a little bit similar and looked at how they constructed it and how they told the story. But it was really just burbling in the back of my mind. And finally, I figured out I could tell it by braiding together the story of Amelia Earhart's life with the story of how these theories developed. So, but it took a while to figure out how to do that because it was a lot of threads to braid together.
How do you differentiate facts that might support the finding and facts that actually don't? So how do you do that? I just give us an example.
Well, the one that caused me the most trouble, or the where I went down a rabbit hole, is, as I mentioned, the Japanese theory. There are people on Saipan and on the Marshall Islands who say that they saw. They say they saw Amelia Earhart, but initially they say they saw a white woman there. And my approach was, I'm not going in trying to prove anybody wrong. I'm trying to give everybody sort of all of these theories, an equal hearing. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to look at all these different eyewitness accounts and I'm going to make a spreadsheet and figure out where each person was and when they were and what they say and see which ones coordinate. And as I was doing that, I just realized they don't match up. There's no way to know which one was true. I mean, I would have just have had to guess in a way because there was nothing confirming any of them. There was no physical evidence of any kind. There wasn't anything specific enough. So I started to read more about eyewitness accounts, talk to lawyers about eyewitness accounts, and just learned that they're not very reliable, that our memory, makes its own stories. And so we might see something, but then we hear another story and we kind of connect the dots that actually didn't happen. But our brain likes to see these patterns that might not be there. So that was hard. And then it was hard to write about it in a way that didn't sound like I was saying, these people are lying, because I didn't think that they were lying. I just thought, maybe some of them were, but that wasn't my overarching belief. I think it was more like they remembered something and then some other story gave them context for that thing. And that turned into a story that they remembered. So that was challenging. And some of the other evidence was, it was just sort of circumstantial. It wasn't tied directly to Earhart. For instance, during World War II, as the American military was finding the Japanese and going from island to island, there would occasionally be these reports of somebody finding, say, a Japanese officer's quarters had lots of pictures of Amelia Earhart up. Or somebody found a suitcase full of clothes, or somebody found a diary that said the 10-year diary of Amelia Earhart, which I just don't think she would bring something like that on a plane when she was counting every ounce of weight. But, people would say that they found these things and they would say, oh, and I turned it into my commanding officer and never saw it again. And nobody's ever seen any of these things again. So that just made me very skeptical of that kind of evidence. But it was challenging.
And of course, there are also a lot of conspiracy theories, right? So talk a little bit about how such theories really evolve into conspiracy potentially.
Yeah, I think that's another thing I really thought about a lot. I think in general, people start to believe in conspiracy theories or connect dots that don't necessarily connect because they want things to make sense. They want, like, it doesn't make sense in a way that somebody as famous as Amelia Earhart disappears and we're never going to know what happens. It's just a story without an ending. And that, makes us kind of uncomfortable not to have an ending, not to have some explanation. And it also doesn't make sense if it was just because there were a bunch of mistakes made in communication and radio transmissions. That's not very interesting. That's just very human and kind of scary, because if it's just mistakes, then it could happen to anyone. But if there's a government theory behind it, then, oh, well, somebody was in charge, even if they were planning something bad. Maybe it was the government who was assigning Amelia Earhart to spy on the Japanese islands. And then there's somebody to blame, and then there's a story, a narrative that makes sense. Otherwise, it makes the world feel kind of chaotic if somebody can just disappear and it's because they ran out of gas. So our minds they just do that. I think for a lot of people too, and this is not just the people who believe some of the wilder theories, but even the people who believe, like the Nikamoraro theory, which is credible enough that National Geographic put money behind it. There is these searches build community. So all the people who have gone on these expeditions to Nikamoraro, there's this community that they've built that sort of transcends their regular life. It's a community of people who know how to get to an isolated island. And when they get there, they know what to do to search it, and they know how to survive on it. So it gives people a sense of purpose. And I think that that's really a big part of it too.
What did the story do to yourself on a personal level?
Oh, that's so interesting. It evolved. I mean, it took me a long time to write the book, and partly because, there were pandemic delays. I had a couple family members die in the midst of it, so I had to take a break. But that really made me think about Earhart's family. Fred Noonan, her navigator, had just been married when he disappeared, but nobody's been able to track down his family members beyond his wife. But Amelia Earhart left behind her mother, her sister, her husband, a nephew and niece. And, they were regular people who missed a person who to them was not an icon, not a celebrity, but their sister, their daughter, their wife, their aunt. And that, it just made me think about the humanity of what happens to someone who becomes so famous and then something terrible happens, and how the family has to make sense of it in a way that maybe is different from the public. The public can speculate and it can be kind of a puzzle and a mystery. But for Earhart's family, this was somebody in our life and she's not there anymore. And we're trying to process or experience the grief, and people keep coming up to us and sort of interrupting that to say, if I find any bones, can I bring them home? Or, all these things that they were bothered with over the years by these searchers. So it made me think more deeply about that.
Did you have to take into account, for example, family members who are still alive while writing the book?
Yes, I mean, I did talk to her niece. Well, her niece passed away about a year ago. So I did talk to her, and I talked to her niece's son. And they, are lovely, impressive people in their own right. They don't really believe, I mean, they have accepted that she's gone, of course, and think she probably ended up in the ocean. And look at all the people who are still spending a lot of money and time to search for her, and they're interested but kind of amused too. It's like, we're fine. Why are you still looking? Um, but yeah, I mean, they were helpful, but they didn't seem to feel like it was their place to object or not object to books about her. I mean,
Competing theories about Earhart's disappearance is also something that obviously, is part of what you are basically laying out in the book. But what I'm really curious is, what is your most compelling theory that you think like that's probably, even if it's the most boring one, it is probably the truth? What's your guess?
I think the one that requires the least amount of explanation, the least amount of leaps of faith, is that she ran out of gas, that she was lost, and she couldn't communicate very well with the Coast Guard ship that was waiting for her at this island. And she and her navigator could not find where the island was, and they ran out of gas and crashed into the ocean. Um, I mean, and again, there's no solid evidence of that beyond, of course, the Coast Guard ship had kept track of all their communications, and apparently she'd only heard them once. She couldn't get her direction finder to work, which would have been able for her to hone in on their signal. They couldn't get their direction finder to hone in on her signal. There were a lot of very credible errors that kind of added up to one big error. And it's not a very sexy story. It's not a very dramatic story, but it's very human that there were all these little errors that in a dangerous flight like this one, I mean, this was about a 20-hour flight over open water, and those little mistakes mattered.
What does the story to you do? And especially also the feedback that you received so far, while searching it, but also writing it and eventually publishing it. So what does it do to you, to your life? What has changed? And also the way you look at life in general.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's so exciting to have written a book. I'm still kind of amazed that it's a real thing and that it's out there in the world, that other people read it. Something that's been very interesting to me, not completely surprising, but I'm still kind of surprised by it, is that how much people still look to Amelia Earhart for inspiration. I mean, she was a very brave person who broke lots of records and did things most people wouldn't do, but she also very much spoke up for women and women's rights to choose what they were going to do and to live life the way they wanted to live it. And, it's 90 years or so since she disappeared, and that message is still one that many women want to hear and that they want to pass on to their daughters. And so it's both exciting and a little bit depressing that it's still so relevant. But yeah, but it is encouraging to think how much people want to know about her, and beyond her status as an icon, they want to know about her as a real human being.
Wow, really, it's incredible what you have written. I can't imagine. But what was the biggest obstacle that you really faced while writing the book?
Oh, myself, basically, just getting myself to sit in the chair and focus. I have been a journalist for my whole career, and that means deadlines, and that means editors waiting for me. And this was much more on my timeline. I mean, I did have an editor waiting for me, but not on a day-to-day basis. So to figure out how I was like to have to be my own boss, um, that is a challenge that I'm still working on.
I think deadlines are actually a true blessing.
Hmm. Oh, for sure. For sure.
I think it's incredible. We oftentimes we think actually it's a cause of stress, but I think it's almost like the opposite, that it actually helps us to really get structure, get things done, and
Hmm.
especially while writing a book like on your own pace. I can't imagine how many occasions you might have had to procrastinate or just do something else because you didn't really
Yeah.
feel like it, right? So how did you overcome all these traps that you faced?
Well, I did try to set myself a schedule, and I used this. This is a plug, but there's this thing called Cave Day where you can sign on, and all these other people are working at the same time. So it makes you feel less alone. And there's something about seeing other people working too that really helped. Um, but yeah, the schedule was the most important thing. And then I would panic always helped because when the deadline started to get closer, I just was like, I have to write all the time. So that's what I did.
Incredible. What would you do different? Because when I hear you speaking, I feel like you really lived basically the perfect life, especially given the fact that you had the chance of really growing up in a very open and way, which on one hand, of course, is a challenge, right? If you don't necessarily know or not really pushed into a corner, but on the other hand, also it kind of frees you and you can explore whatever you want, right? If both
Hmm.
sides have its advantages and disadvantages, but what is really, would you do anything differently, looking back?
Over my whole life.
Yes.
Oh, I think I would have taken more risks when I was younger. Like, oddly, I take way more risks now than I did when I was in my 20s. Because in my 20s, I thought there were a lot of things I couldn't do, and I didn't realize that the only way you could do them is by doing them instead of waiting to be ready. So I wish that I had, for instance, gone abroad and worked as a stringer and wrote stories internationally, or worked at a local paper and learned that way. But I just thought that, I don't know, I think I was waiting for somebody to invite me. So I would encourage people just to go out and make a ton of mistakes.
That's incredible. I really love that. What makes you feel truly alive?
Oh, I feel truly alive when I'm writing, when I get into that flow state, which doesn't happen every day. I also feel very alive just when I'm outside. I mean, I have a dog that you may have heard behind me, but just being out with her, or, you know, i- the wonderful thing about having a dog is that you have to go out in every kind of weather. You can't second guess it. You just have to go and experience it. And I think rather than resenting that, I think that's a huge gift because then I just feel part of the world.
Amazing. Last question. Tell us why I and everyone who is listening should really buy your book and really read it, because I am looking for an outstanding book really that I can digest over the summer. And why do you think we really should, all who are listening, really buy a copy of your outstanding book?
Well, I think one thing the book really does is capture how Amelia Earhart was a person, and a person who took a while to become the person that we thought she would know, or that we know now. And there were a lot of moments where she could have died, and she didn't, and she kept taking more and more risks. And you get to meet some very interesting people who have followed these theories. Some of them may seem more sane than others, but they're all very interesting and they're all very admirable in their own way. You get to see how people, Amelia Earhart and the people who push these theories are consumed by their passions and devoted to them and really becoming more and more skilled as they pursue them. So I think I just love to see that. That's one of my favorite things about being a journalist, is talking to people about why they do whatever they're doing. So I hope that these people come alive and you can feel a little bit of that residual thrill of pursuing some sort of end.
Rachel Hartigan, thank you so much for being truly a blessing to myself and really to the world. And I invite everyone really to get a copy of Lost, Amelia Earhart's 3 Mysterious Deaths and 1 Extraordinary Life, published by National Geographic in 2026. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rachel Hartigan. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com.